something on the blog that was called "Is the Western World Balanced?" We try to process everything through the filter of the scientific method. So if you're familiar with the scientific method, you know that it's, can it be validated? Can it be replicated? Is there an objective way that we can do this every time and get the same results? So we want to be able to quantify everything, predict everything, have control over everything, and just know everything. And this is why we see ourselves as a culture bumping up against so many limitations in science. We're starting to see people questioning research and its validity. We see a lot of correlation and assumed causation. So we see two things happening and it's just sort of assumed that they are causing one another, when in reality that hasn't even been proven. We see a lot of studies that contradict each other. A lot of really minute detail, like eat 2 apples a day and you won't get cancer. And then Harvard does a study that says, turns out if you eat 2 apples a day, you definitely get cancer. And it's starting to become obvious, I think, even to the uneducated, the average person, that there's some aspect of science and academia that's kind of scrambling. And it's because nature itself can't be funneled through the scientific method. So nature is not a part of the scientific method. The scientific method is a part of nature. So we're taking one little logical aspect that is useful in itself. It's very useful for some things. I'm not discrediting science, but we try to apply it to essentially feminine energy. And this is where things get a little controversial, because when you're trying to apply, you're enforcing the scientific method onto nature, intuition, emotion. That's overstepping a boundary. And first of all, you're not going to get repeat results. So if you do a study on there have been some studies on, whether or not the moon impacts female menstrual cycles. And, of course, all the findings were totally different. Some found that it did, some found that it didn't, some overlapped a little bit. So we always get these inconclusive results when we're trying to measure the unmeasurable. We're basically trying to measure the feminine, the subjective, the creative, the subconscious, all of these murky, darker energy, unknown emotion. We're trying to measure all of that and explain it all and control it all. And this is generally innocent. It means that we want control over our lives, and we have anxiety about not having that control. But ultimately, this trying to quantify everything, it's very hyper masculine. And obviously I'm not saying that men are bad. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's hyper masculine. We're trying to take all the feminine and funnel it through this lens of masculine, and it never works. And so what science does when this doesn't work is they say that they've disproved it. So if someone says, I'm an energy healer, all of my clients benefit from my healing sessions, Reiki or whatever. Bioenergy healing is a good one. And then scientists try to measure that and say, we're totally open-minded to it. If it works, it works. But we'll see. And so they do the study, and the study just gives random results because everyone is a completely different person having a completely different subjective experience. And so they test and they say, well, Reiki does not, our results show that it does not appear to be real. And then they just, the same with like crystals. Do crystals emit a charge? Do they help people heal? A lot of people who are in the spiritual world use crystals and swear by them. Science, if you've seen all the, I think like Bill Nye is like ranting against crystal people. It's basically overstepping. We have this dogma in science. Ironically, it turns into a dogma because we start overstepping these boundaries and we start saying the feminine, the creative, the intuition, all that. If we can't prove it through our framework numerically, if we can't quantify it, control it, predict it, then it's not real. And it's like, well, that's not true. That's not how reality works. But it would be very nice if it were, for those people who do really want to believe that they can predict and measure and control everything, because it's a really deep insecurity thing. It's not on the surface at all. It's very deep subconscious in the collective insecurity, and we get really reactive and uncomfortable. This is why people get really just reactive when someone vouches for energy healing or something. Like, everyone gets uncomfortable, and it's because of this desperation to disprove what we can't control and measure, because we don't want it to exist in some sense. If it exists, that means there is a shitload more for most people to learn. And most people don't want to learn because we've been taught. Remember, as we talked about in the I'm a mess video, like, the better thing to say is I'm learning, and that's okay. Most people don't want to admit that they have things to learn because we're taught, just in general, in culture, that we're not supposed to be learning past a certain age. We're supposed to already know everything. And so, long story short, in this article entitled, "Is the Western World Balanced?" the answer is no, we're not balanced, because we're trying to filter everything through the lens of logic and science, and some things are not a part of logic and science. Science is a part of it. So one day we will get to a point where science can explain all of these phenomenon that it can't currently explain, like channeling, for example. Studies have shown that channels, when people are in a channeling state, their brain waves change, so they do go into a trance state, and they can measure the change in brain waves, but that's about it. That's about as far as science can go. So the only way to embark on this learning curve is through subjective experience. So anecdotal, what science would call invalid, that's what you actually have to do. You have to go through your own literal experience and interact with reality yourself, and then you can know for sure. It's not a matter of whether something's real or not. It's a matter of whether or not it works for you and you prefer it. If you prefer it, then it's real. If for whatever reason you don't like it, then you don't have to do it. But you can't say that it's not real, because it's subjective. So we can't overwrite this idea that some truths are subjective.